Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. It's good to be back with you, and I apologize for the length of the break between the last episode and now. There's been some continued ongoing health issues here. We're transitioning to homeschool for our children, which is a big change, as anyone who has done that will attest to. And on top of that, also, I'm trying to build up some things on this end, including getting more episodes out to you guys. And one of the things I'm doing is I've started to build a Substack. So you can find that in the show notes, and all my podcasts will be posting there as well as wherever you've been listening to them. And then also I'm going to be posting devotions and articles. Now there's a way to subscribe there if you wish to support what I'm doing here. Or you can just be a free subscriber to get like free devotions and just keep up with the podcast. I'd really highly recommend you check it out. I'm going to be getting that kind of the momentum that it's building, so there'll be more things coming out on there in the coming weeks. The goal right now is to have a weekly devotion that comes up there, and then again, like focused topic articles. I've got lots of different things in mind. There's no short supply of things to talk about in the craziness of the world that we are currently living in. In fact, that's one of the things I sit down and chat with a man named John Holler about today. Many of you may know him. John Holler is a semi-retired attorney, trial attorney, who has been teaching and prophecy watching for many years. And in fact, funny enough, I live in the same state as John, and I had heard him reference Ohio, which is where I currently live, in a podcast he was doing with someone named Tom Hughes, who runs a ministry called Hope for Our Times, which I will link in the show notes as well, and highly recommend you check them out. And after I'd heard John talk to Tom on his program several times, I started watching John Holler's prophecy updates on Fellowship Bible Chapel's YouTube page. And my wife and my children and I have even been to the church several times and have sat and watched the different prophecy updates and had a chance to fellowship with the people there. So today I'm just going to sit down with John and have a very casual conversation about many different topics, a little bit about who John is and his background, and just a lot of the different things that are going on in the world, and our as a church, our view of prophecy. And we really kind of go here, there, and everywhere, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. One last thing I need to mention. I pulled a rookie mistake. It's been a while since I've recorded a podcast, and I somehow forgot to plug in my podcasting microphone, so the computer speakers were picking me up. So John's going to sound great, and I'm going to sound so-so. So I apologize for the sound being a little iffy on my end, but that being said, I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to this late hour, casual conversation. Welcome to this late hour, casual conversation. Welcome to this late hour, casual conversation. Getting real, going deeper, unscripted. Getting real, going deeper, unscripted. Getting real, going deeper, unscripted. I'm your host, Casey Knowlton. Well, I'd like to welcome John Holler to this late hour. John, how are you?
Great to be with you, Casey. I'm doing well. Doing well.
Yeah, you and I were talking just before I recorded here, and you were mentioning just getting over a bout of COVID. How you doing? You feeling better?
Yeah, we're doing good. It was pretty mild this time. I had this is at least the third time that we've had it. but this was by far the mildest. This was like a bad cold. I had a scratchy throat, and then I went out to play golf on a very hot day in California, and the first played 2 holes, and it was like I was really getting winded just walking from the golf cart to the green. So I played 5 more holes, but it took me about 2 hours, and I'm a pretty fast golfer. So I mean, I've played 18 holes in 51 minutes before. So for me to take 2 hours for 7 holes when nobody else is on the course is pretty amazing. And I think I was sort of on the verge of getting a heat stroke.
Hmm.
I never got a fever or anything, but I then the next morning was I had could hardly talk, and I sort of had a shortness of breath. So, but we've got over it. There's a couple little lingering things. This time, what happened to my wife, the first 2 times we had it, is she lost her sense of taste and smell. I did the first time
Hmm.
for about 10 weeks, and hers was not just lost, but it was messed up. So things like steak tasted like something very, very bad. And this for her, it kind of went away and then it came back. And so she really struggled with it for about 2.5 years, which is very, I don't know if 2.5 years, a couple of years. And it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's just depressing. You can't eat anything, nothing tastes right, nothing sounds good. You don't feel like eating. Um, I noticed this time it sort of affected my appetite. I just didn't care if I ate. But they've got a lot more treatments now for it, antivirals, and
Hmm.
we've always taken some of the drugs in the recommended package from alternative medicine.
Yes, they should not
Um,
be named, right?
yeah, and you we have a supply of it. We got some from some friends who shall remain nameless, and so everything went well. The antivirals they put you on though are pretty heavy duty medications with some side effects, but we're okay.
That's good. Yeah. Or quick aside, and then I'm going to ask a little more about who you are, so people can have a chance to get to know you if they don't know you already. But back in the early onset of the pandemic, my wife's asthmatic, and she and I both got it quite badly. And basically, so she's calling. This is before there was a lot of information on treatments. As it was early on, and they said, "Well, we can't do anything for you. Basically, you just have to wait till you're blue in the face, and then you can come to the ER." And we knew if we waited, she could get pneumonia with her asthma. And
Yeah,
so she had to, God bless her, she's really good researcher, and she doesn't take no for an answer with things like this. So she was researching these old, really old school medicines from colonial days. They would take mustard plaster, put it on a cloth, heat it
right.
up and put that on your chest to kind of uh, bring out the infection. And by God's grace, doing that actually is what got her through it. And she never had to go to the hospital. We were about an hour away from going to the hospital. If this didn't work, that was, who knows what would have happened, but really
Yeah,
thankful.
I've had a number of friends who didn't come back from the hospital. Some did, some didn't.
Yeah.
It's a very strange phenomenon.
Yeah. I've had the
Yeah,
same.
I'm almost 70 years old, and it's like um, you always know that something like this could happen, though. I mean, whether it's engineered or not, or a leak, or whatever the cause of it is. I think there's a lot of good research out there to indicate that it was a leak. The question is whether it was intentional or not,
Right.
and whether it was designed or not. I do think I sort of agree with some of the comments that Bobby Kennedy made that it was sort of designed to attack certain racial groups, and
Mm.
certain racial groups were excluded from that. Of course, the Chinese and that type of thing. But it's been a struggle with people everywhere around the world on how to deal with this thing.
Yes. Well, you've been teaching on prophecy for quite a while. So For those who don't know you in my audience, can you explain who you are and how you came to be involved in, teaching on and prophecy watching?
Sure. I grew up in a pastor's home. My dad was a Grace Brethren pastor for 40 years. He was just getting ready to retire when he passed away in 1991. And he was a big Bible prophecy guy. He had gone to Bob Jones University and Grace Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
And Grace was a premillennial dispensational school. One of his classmates there was a guy named John Whitcomb. Whitcomb was one of the co-authors of the Genesis flood back I think it came out about 1960.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always had Dad would have these conferences and people would come and, John Whitcomb would come and, they'd come over to the house for dinner or after they spoke. I mean, I don't know how you grew up, but I grew up in a evangelical church. We lived in a parsonage across the street from the church till I was about 13. Then they bought one that was about 2 or 3 blocks away. But, growing up for me, the church was almost like an extension of the house.
Yeah.
So if I was always having to go over there, my sister would go over there and take piano lessons and that type of thing. And every now and then they would make me go over and get something out of the basement in the dark, which I could get up the steps and all the way around the corner of the building and hear the door shut behind me because I was running for my life. As an 8-year-old, I sort of learned how to do that. But and I can remember what some of the earliest memories I have is the bedroom that my brother and I shared upstairs in the house. Look, you could not see Dad's office because the front of the church blocked it. But like on Sunday morning, you would wake up at like 2, 3 in the morning and you could see the fluorescent lights on in his office. They, lighting up the parking lot. Because he would always go over and do final sermon prep and teaching prep. And he just didn't teach on Sunday. He taught Sunday night. He taught Wednesday night.
Mm-hmm.
He often did radio programs and that type of thing, which is, as someone who, I prepare now, it's pretty amazing. And he was very meticulous the way he maintained his sermon notes. I still have some of them, but he kept all the sermon notes in these little half-page sized notebooks, and he organized them by topic, book, Bible, prophecy, series on characters of the Bible and that type of thing. And he always wrote in there when he gave them. So, and I remember he always said, as a kid growing up there, he was taught in his church, the First Brethren Church of Dayton, Ohio. There, at the time, it was on the west side of Dayton, about a mile away from the Wright brothers' bicycle shop. So Dad would have been growing up in the 1920s, about 20 years after the Wright brothers, had leapt to fame and starting flight.
That's great.
So he was born in 1923. They discovered flight, or had were able to accomplish the first powered flight, I think, in 1903. So he kind of grew up in that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a working class neighborhood in Dayton. His dad was an electrician, but he had a good pastor. I mean, and there were a lot of young guys grew up in that church that went into the pastorate. Dad, through his pastor, Dr. Russell Barnard, he became very enamored with foreign missions and served for many years on the Grace Brethren Foreign Mission Board. And there were other people. There was his best friend growing up became a chaplain in the Navy. And he just stayed in the Navy after World War II. And then I had an uncle who also grew up in that church, and he was in seminary, married to my father's sister. And I was just doing a little research on this the other night, and they had a child. They had a girl. In fact, she just passed away last year. But and a boy. But my Aunt Mary was 3 months pregnant when Uncle Rodney got pancreatic cancer and died.
Hmm.
So my cousin grew up never meeting his father. And Uncle Rodney was, of course, I never met him. I came along a couple of years later. but he was 27 years old when he died. And but he came from that church, and so there was this something going on in that church where all these young men wanted to go into the ministry full time. So Dad loved Bible prophecy. I remember in the 1967 war, because he was big on Israel, always talking about Israel, the prophetic significance of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And I agree with that. So in 1967, I have his notes, where he talked for several weeks about what happened in the 6-Day War. And so it was interesting. I went to Israel in 2017. We went over there. I think it was our third or fourth trip. Excuse me, I got to keep my whistle wet.
No, that's fine.
But we so in 2017 we went over because it was the 50th anniversary of the 6-Day War, and that was kind of I was 13 years old when that happened. I kind of remember it, and we had a very interesting trip. We spent some time. Some friends provided the ability for Joel Kramer. We stayed in some friends' wonderful, great friends' apartment in Jerusalem, about 1 block from the old city. And then they also provided that we would be able to tour around for a number of days with Joel Kramer. And I don't know if you know Joel Kramer, but I had taken biblical archaeology in college, so I've always kind of had an interest in it. My professor for biblical archaeology at Grace College.
Does he have a YouTube channel?
What's that?
Does Joel Kramer? Am I thinking of the guy who has a YouTube channel? And
yeah, he has a YouTube channel called Expedition Bible.
Oh, I watch it all the time. He did a great video on Babylon and the curses up against Babylon.
Yeah, he probably has 10 times the number of subscribers that we have on Fellowship Bible Chapel, and that he's only been on. I think he's only been on YouTube for a couple of years. I'd highly recommend people to go to Expedition Bible, and you can also go to YouTube and just type in Joel Kramer Shechem, Joel Kramer Hebron.
Yes, and
people have sort of videoed. They're not the best quality videos, but they've videoed Joel, what Joel did with us. We went to Qumran, we went to Shechem, we went to Jacob's Well, we went to Mount Gerizim, Samaria, Hebron, Shiloh, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and that type of thing. And so in that, every time I've gone to Israel, first time was 1995, it's really had an impact on me. So I would say in 1995, I was I was about 41 years old on our first trip. And I was kind of, I would guess I was sort of in a dry spell in my walk with the Lord. I mean, I wasn't doing anything wrong. It's just that I was very busy at work. I was traveling all the time as a trial lawyer. And so but that trip really, hit me with the reality of the historicity of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. I remember just one day we was up in the Galilee. We were staying in a hotel on the Sea of Galilee in Tiberias. And so we went up to the Mount of Beatitudes, and we went up to the Golan Heights, and we went to the Tagba, the place of the loaves and fishes. And we sort of later in the day, before we took the boat ride across the Sea of Galilee back to Tiberias, we ended up in Capernaum. And I remember going over and just kind of sitting down on a rock, I think it was an old wine press or olive press. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it really moved me to tears, because it just sort of hit me that all the stuff is really real in the Bible. And it just sort of converged on me there. So, I mean, everybody has a different experience, but I'm just saying that for me, that was kind of a wake up call. And on that call, there was a young guy, probably young enough to be my son, by the way, but he was on the trip, and he said, "Hey, have you ever heard of this guy named Chuck Missler?" I said, no, I haven't heard of him. So that's 1995. So he gave me a Chuck Missler tape on the Gog Magog War of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And so if you never really heard, I think a lot of people identify with Chuck. Chuck became a friend. I didn't agree with him on all the stuff that he said or did or whatever he eventually ended up. But, Chuck was a business guy, but he taught Bible. He was a business guy, but he taught Bible prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
And so he brought a very sort of different perspective to it than pastors just had sometimes, that got maybe a little bit of tunnel vision. Chuck kind of came at it from a whole different way. So I started listening to Chuck. I eventually got to meet him. I did a show on WRFD one summer during the Y2K days in 1999. And I got to meet a lot of guys like Dave Hunt and Chuck Missler and other guys during that. And then my wife's mother got remarried. Her father had died. She got remarried in 1999. And they split their time between California and Ohio. He was an old family friend from years ago. His wife had passed away. So we started spending a lot of time in Southern California. So through that, I got to sort of renew. We were out there a lot. I met Bill Koenig. I don't know if you've heard of Bill Koenig, watch.org. Became a very good friend. He said, well, I do this conference at Calvary Chapel Chino Hills with David Hocking like 2 years out of 3. So that I went there and I started meeting other people that were there. And we spent a lot of time in Phoenix. And there was a good Calvary Chapel there, pastored by John Higgins, who was one of the original Calvary Chapel guys with Chuck Smith. And they would just focus a lot on Bible prophecy. So maybe I'm just a pushy guy. I got to meet a lot of these guys. And so I sort of revived my interest in it, started studying. And then I started teaching a large class in a large church. And I would do like a prophecy update and Bible teaching. And so over time, the prophecy update started taking more time because more and more things happen.
Right.
So in 2013, we left that church. We helped start Fellowship Bible Chapel. We bought property about 5 years ago up in Sunbury, Ohio, which I used to joke with all the people at the church we used to go to who lived in Sunbury. Why do you live in Sunbury? Now I'm helping teach and pastor at a church in Sunbury. It's kind of ironic. But in 2013, just before we left and started the church, I had started to put some the stuff up, audio recordings on YouTube. And part of it was just so people in the class that missed, they said, we missed last week. Is there something you can do to keep us, caught up?
Right.
And so I was burning DVDs. I was making tapes. I was doing, it was crazy. And then this wonderful thing called YouTube came along. So we started putting stuff on YouTube. And that first year, putting stuff up with the church and everything, maybe putting up 1 or 2 things a week, we got like 17,000 views the whole year of 2013. And it just, I think it's a God thing. The Lord, we never promoted it. We never advertised it. And it just seemed, people started sharing it on social media. It seemed to resonate with some people. And so now we're probably getting in the millions of views each year.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I think everyone, well, I don't want to say everyone, but I think a lot of people instinctively sense something is going on, that this is a very significant time.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're being drawn to, well, what does the Bible say about, the times we're in? Does it have any answers? And of
right.
course, some of these people are Christians and already know to look there. But here's an interesting question for you, John. What do you make of pastors, even other, brothers and sisters in Christ, who just seemingly have no value or see no value in biblical prophecy or eschatology? What do you think? What do you think is driving that?
Well, I think in part, there is this thing called the normalcy bias, so that even if the world is falling apart, I'm sure there were probably people in Germany in World War II who thought, well, it's really not that bad. Okay. We can't buy gas for the car every week, but it's life is still pretty normal. And I even struggle with that too, because my life is pretty normal, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm I still have a few cases, things that I'm handling as a lawyer, but that part of my life is pretty much over. I'm never going to take on a big case at this stage of my career. At least that I maybe I shouldn't say that so definitively. That because then certainly then something will happen. So maybe somebody will actually bring me a really important case, but the chances of that are pretty slim. But even I say a lot of times, like my life, I said this, I think I said this when I talked to Tom Hughes at Hope for Our Times. I think he played the interview. I think it was yesterday. I lose track of time. When you're not working every day, you sort of like, okay, which day feels more like Saturday than it used to be. When no day ever felt like Saturday. Now it's like it's kind of hard to remember what day of the week it is. But so I think an interview at Hope for Our Times with Tom was yesterday, and I said, my life is pretty normal. I talk about a lot of things that are pretty dark, pretty.
Mm-hmm.
They can be overwhelming. I'll admit that. So if you can't take it, listen for 10 minutes and go away and come back later. But I'm more about truth than I am about people's comfort.
Mm.
So, and I think, the Bible always has these warnings about the fact that people are going to, Timothy, it talks about gathering unto them teachers, itching ears that
Mm-hmm.
will tell them what they want to hear. And this is a big problem in the church today. What claims to be the church. I wonder how much of it is the real church, to be honest with you. But so a couple of years ago, I did a conference in Calgary. I actually did it live in May, Last Days Bible Conference. I think I talked 4 or 5 times. You can get it, Last Days Bible Conference, on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
But for that conference 2 years ago, I sort of came up with because I've been talking about all these things and I've tried to depict things graphically. I kind of like images. One of the things I tried to do as a trial lawyer was to try to, particularly if I had a complex financial case, I tried to put up graphics so they could kind of understand how the money flowed or was supposed to flow.
Mm-hmm.
And because people are very visual now. And so I was doing this a long time ago. By the way, as a trial lawyer, I did a talk at a conference in California in 2001. It was really like 6 weeks before 9/11. And I talked about what I thought was going to be the coming effect of postmodernism on the church, where truth was very relative. Truth was based on your experience.
Mm.
And I actually got pushback from some pastors after that talk.
And yet here we are.
Yeah. And so because they said, well, John, you don't understand postmodernism. I'm like, well, what do you mean I don't understand postmodernism? Maybe you don't. They said, well, it'll be a good thing for the church because people are asking questions. But, asking questions, that's just kind of a postmodern trap to just avoid getting to the truth of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
So, I started working and teaching on so I was teaching a class, I was doing apologetics and Bible prophecy and that type of thing. But back to Calgary 2 years ago, I did a conference, was online, of course, because we couldn't get into Canada because of the Canadian government restrictions. And I sort of developed a grid about sort of the major themes of what I see in Bible prophecy that are happening. So I think there is a fair amount of confusion out there. I will note that I have, opinions on timing of the rapture and all of this other stuff. But I think the thing we need to be willing to admit is that when we talk about these future events that are set forth in the Bible, they're future events.
Mm-hmm.
They have not yet happened. And I think the last 3 years, so 2 years ago when I was doing the Calgary talk, the first one,
Mm-hmm.
I was sort of thinking like, now wait a minute, we've just gone through a year where the world changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think within the Bible prophecy community of teachers, a lot of great guys, everybody's trying to figure it out. Nobody really called it. So I think sometimes Bible prophecy sort of unfolds and we understand that it's unfolded and been fulfilled after the fact. So let me give you an example of that. So in Matthew, it talks about there's this passage that says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son, calls his name Emmanuel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's based on a prophecy in Isaiah. And if you go to look at the prophecy in Isaiah, I'll be honest with you, kind of even knowing that this Matthew told us this is that which this, the birth of Jesus fulfilled this prophecy. You're looking at what it says in Isaiah and it's like, how did they get in there? And then my question was, were people running around Judah looking for people from the line of David, saying, are there any pregnant virgins around? And I don't see that there's any historical evidence that they were. But after the fact, they were able to say, oh, this is that. That's what that was about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we need to understand that when we talk about future events, they're not facts yet. And what happens is a lot of people get sort of wedded to their idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then the facts on the ground may say, well, it's just not going to work out that way. Not that you were totally wrong. Okay. I think there's certainly room in this whole thing with the prophetic scriptures for what I would call righteous speculation. But I don't think that I don't think that being incredibly dogmatic and divisive over your particular eschatological view is going to win over a lot of people. This is just my opinion. So look, I do conferences with the guys. I don't agree with them on a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't agree with me. But in the end, we're sort of all in this together and we're all trying to figure it out. So I kind of came up with this grid that prophecy is patterned in Jewish scripture. So what happened before will happen again, and it might be more clear than it was before. So there probably was the historical thing that Isaiah was talking about, a young woman conceiving, but then it became very clear in the end. Trying to think of another prophecy where that might be.
Well, that's a really good example. If I'm not mistaken,
Mhm.
many of the first century Jews would basically say, hey, God's only son is Israel. So how dare you suggest otherwise?
Yeah, but did they come up with that as a response to the Christian saying this is the way the Christianity developed, saying this is that which was prophesied, and they didn't like that. I mean, there's a lot of my friend Doug Woodward has done a pretty good book called Rebooting the Bible, where he goes back and looks at how maybe the Masoretic text is not the best way to get what the Hebrew was talking about because it's been tampered with a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the Septuagint seems to be pretty accurate. So anyway, so I just think we need to be sort of humble in the way we approach this. And so the prophecy is pattern thing kind of works this way.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because that's something I mention often on the podcast is like we are dealing with prophecy here. We have to, approach it in humility and we can't get dogmatic and kind of, what's very classically happened in the church is you have everyone break off into their own little groups of this denomination and that logical position and this and that and the other thing. And one of the things I want to see and encourage is, we politely disagree on different things, but we still, in the end, are brothers and sisters in Christ, and we are pursuing the truth together and looking toward the hopeful return of Christ.
Yeah, and I will say I belong to some prophecy groups on Facebook. I don't participate very much. I sort of read them occasionally and get depressed. Not in the sense the vitriol that's thrown around
Mm-hmm.
in cases where you believe in the work of Jesus Christ, you believe full prophecy, you believe in Israel, you believe in a coming rapture, you believe in a coming kingdom, you're premillennial, and but because you disagree on one point, the vitriol is just it's not godly.
Right.
And so I try not to do that. Okay. Now look, there are certain things where I'm going to be pretty strong and dogmatic. For example, I used to talk a lot about the emerging church, postmodernism, and that type of thing. And I really came down hard on Rob Bell. I don't usually use the H word, but with a guy like Bell, I think the H word is probably definitely appropriate. And so I think that, but you're mentioning about all the different denominations that have kind of come about as people agree or disagree on things. So I grew up in a Grace Brethren tradition. But when you look at the Brethren tradition, which really started in the early 1600s, I think, and is either maybe it was 1700s in Schwarzenau, Germany. And so the small group came to America. They didn't like the way the Reformation was going, and so they believed in adult believer baptism. And so that there are a few things distinctives. And so they came to America. As they've come to America, they've divided into about 7 different groups.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's some efforts being made to put them back together. And I'm not really part of the Brethren movement anymore, but I can remember I believe one of the splits happened in the late 1800s. And it was over 2 groups that were arguing about how many buttons a man was allowed to have on a shirt.
Oh, good grief.
And so that, 5 buttons was a sort. One group accused the other of being proud by having too many buttons. And they literally split.
That's crazy.
So in some, it's unfortunate. But sometimes by splitting, they become more effective because they're able to achieve more growth. So there can be growth by division. But when you say these things about there's this research, I see the number float around that there's 40,000 different evangelical denominations. And I don't believe that. I believe that number is way overstated. And unless you're talking about eschatology, and then you're talking at least 85,000 different denominations, because everybody has an opinion on it. And because I have, sort of attracted a following, I guess, people send me stuff. I mean, I have books and books and books and charts and graphs and handwritten things, and all these people who do this. I mean, you can tell, man, they really love the Lord. They love the scripture and everything, and they're trying to figure it out. And I am too. We're all sort of on this journey. And Daniel has this passage in Daniel chapter 12 says, Daniel, see up the book. Daniel says, what does all this mean? I don't understand this. And Daniel 8, he says, I don't understand what this is that's going on. And he's told a couple times, seal up the book until the time of the end. Then knowledge, people will run to and fro. Knowledge will increase, and the wise will understand and instruct many. So there's this thing that I think we should, as a friend of mine says, we should jealously guard the people who are digging into the scripture and trying to figure this stuff out. Mm-hmm. And not as a way to separate with them over that, but to learn, let's all learn this together. Yeah. And so that's what I try to do. And I'll admit I'm not perfect at it. And there are some times where there's a line that gets crossed and you just have to say, I can't go along with that. So I think if there's one thing that I'm trying to do is to try to just sort of guard myself from getting caught up in that. Got to divide. There's some times when you got to, but I remember there was a split in the Grace Brethren the year after my father passed away, and I'm not so sure that God didn't call Dad home, because I think it would have broke him up to watch that. And now, I mean, I'm looking at it 30 some years later, and I'm like, I don't even really remember what it was all about.
Did someone have too many buttons on their shirt?
Nah, it was over some theological issues, and I think there were some valid concerns. And look, I left. I had concerns when I was on the board at Grace about the direction of particularly the spiritual formation program in the seminary. And I'm on the board, and I think I've always viewed one of my roles on the board was to protect the historic theological basis of the institution.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that this was undermining that on, I don't know how else to say it, an epic scale.
Mm.
Um, so you know, I wrote a big paper about it, and I don't know that it was well received. Some people did, some people didn't. Um, and I was asked to resign from the board, so I did. I'd been on the board for about 25 years total at that point, and that's okay. They've gone on probably to greater success than they had when I was on the board, and that's fine. But I'm still concerned about the direction of that program and the direction of that program in many institutions, many evangelical seminaries, particularly. And then things keep being brought in, like the Enneagram and things that are just absolute pagan in origin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they're just accepted throughout not only seminaries, but the evangelical church. So one of the talks I did a couple of years ago at Calgary was on the Enneagram, because it's just awful, and it's part of this mysticism that's coming in. It's sort of a bringing in Roman Catholic mysticism. So anyway, I just think that it's a very unique time to be alive.
Yes.
I did say to my stepfather-in-law out in California, who's 96, and we had not been able to see him for 4 years because of this Charlie Victor thing that's been going around. But I did say, for lack of a better term, I said, Tom, I'm glad when I look at what's going on in the world that I'm an old fart, which means I'm not going to be around here forever if the Lord tarries. And he goes, man, I'm so glad of that every day.
Hmm.
I'm ready to go. And so I think you get that perspective. So I did. So like I said, so back to the prophecy as pattern. By the way, I mentioned Joel Kramer. Got to mention his book, Where God Came Down,
Mm-hmm.
by Joel Kramer. Get it. You can get it at Amazon and that type of thing. I don't get a commission or anything like that. But I think it will help you piece together the historicity, the archaeological verification of important parts of Scripture. And I'm sure this is part one of many parts. And this is, when looking through the book, some of when you do a tour with Joel, and hopefully I'm going to try to do a tour of Israel in the not too distant future. But, one of my goals will be to go to these sites in the biblical heartland.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of tours, they sort of circle the biblical heartland. And now I think there's more tours going to Shiloh, which is good. It's more open up. But Shechem is hard to get to. A lot of people don't. I know people who've been to Israel many, many times, never been to Hebron, to the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the Cave of Machpelah, and the ancient Tell at Hebron. And it's a divided city. I mean, I was down there in this past December, and we wanted to go up to a place called Mamre, which is where Abraham got the promise. The three angels showed up, and Yahweh met Abram by the oaks of Mamre.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go to that place. It's been preserved historically. Herod built there, just like he built at Machpelah, to sort of commemorate these important events in biblical history, in the history of Israel, and what we would, I think, sort of just call Jewish history now. That's sort of the way the term has developed. And they're real places. I mean, and you drive to Mamre, you got to go through drive around these checkpoints and everything, because the citizens of Israel cannot go there because of the division in the land. They're not allowed by law to go there. They're not allowed to go to Shechem. To me, it's a scandal. But we as Christians can go, and we can go tell them about the truth of those places. in what's really there and what the archaeological evidence is. So where God came down. But back to this thing. So the Jewish, I sort of had these rabbit trail tendencies, as you probably know from listening to me. But so the first point that I talked about in my talk in Calgary 2 years ago was that there's this acceleration that's going to happen. And that's because what happened at the first coming of Jesus prophetically that pattern will repeat itself, not the specific prophecies, but the way they unfolded in the fact that when you look at all the prophecies that were fulfilled at the first coming of Jesus, about 60% of them were fulfilled in the Passion Week between the triumphal, around the time of the triumphal entry on what we call Palm Sunday up through his death, burial, resurrection, and then his ascension to heaven 40 days later, and then Pentecost. And so there's just this tremendous acceleration of the prophecies being fulfilled.
Yeah, I have to confess, I do, which whether it's right or wrong, I can't know because it's, like you said, in the future, but I do favor or have leanings toward, based on what we see with Christ fulfilling the feasts, a possible something significant, let's say, happening on Rosh Hashanah. So I do tend to get a little excited.
The Feast of Trumpets.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, but listen, so that's another example. So how were the, and I object to this thing that they're the Feast of Israel. They're the feast of the Lord. The feasts are there to teach us about our Messiah, our Savior, our Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think consigning them over to just Israel or Jewish people is sort of short-sighted. And you have to decide, people have to decide how they're going to celebrate or remember the feast, but certainly they're important to study. But the pattern is there because those feasts were all fulfilled in one calendar cycle.
Mm.
So that's the spring feast. The fall feast will be fulfilled. Well, now, if they're fulfilled in one calendar cycle in the first coming, will they not be fulfilled in one calendar cycle in the second coming? And now that upends a lot of people's timelines and charts and graphs and all that stuff. But I'm pretty convinced of that. And I personally do believe the way this redemptive thing of Israel and everything fits into this, that the second coming will come on a Day of Atonement.
Mm. Yeah.
So, and 10 days before that is Rosh Hashanah. And the period in between is known as the days of awe. I mean, that's how the people of Israel described it. So what does that, and how does that fit into prophetic history? And I'm sort of working through that.
Here's a question. So, and this I know probably drives our pre-trib friends crazy, but I'm quite convinced that we may be entering very soon, or may have already entered, the time of the seven seals. And that's, obviously holding a pre-wrath view. That's part of what that entails. But just,
Sure.
I see, everywhere in the news, someone given authority. There's several examples I could give of that with King Charles, with the WHO and the authority they were given. And there's some other examples as well. You've got peace taken from the earth. How many examples could I give from that? You have the issue of inflation and starvation and
famine. So just in the last couple of weeks, we've had Russia and the Ukraine war. Ukraine is a very significant agricultural country. There was an article at the Atlantic, which is just because I recommend something from the Atlantic doesn't mean I agree with everything they say, because I try to learn from, I read the New York Times, I read the Financial Times, and because you can kind of learn how to get past the propaganda, because there are facts buried in there, in all the spin and everything. But so we've just seen that there's been this, the Atlantic article was Ukraine could feed the world. And, if properly managed, Ukraine maybe could feed the world. That's how significant it is agriculturally. But now we have this destruction of the oil, gas, system that's necessary for fertilizers. We have, Ukraine's a big country on fertilizer. Russia's a big country on fertilizer. And Russia's gone in and, they had a grain deal for a while, and somebody blew up a very important bridge of Russia. Now, I think it's been repaired, but Russia, in response to that, has pretty much obliterated the grain exporting capabilities of Ukraine. And they can't get it out by rail. It only goes out by ship. That's the only way to get it out of there. There's just not a rail system to do it, and particularly in the course of a war. So now, we may have had, and I always talk about these things in long term, without, I don't want people to think, oh, well, John Howard doesn't think the Lord could return soon. And I'm like, no, I really think he could. But I'm just sort of looking at it in the long-term trends. Ukraine is effectively destroyed as an agricultural force in the world for a generation. And we need to process that, because you're talking, in some cases, 10, 15, 20% of the particular foodstuffs come from Ukraine. And Russia's a fairly important agricultural country too. And now Ukraine has been attacking some of their major ports on the Black Sea. And the problem is going to be that Russia cannot pivot to get that stuff out on their grains and everything. They can't do it by rail. They're at capacity for rail. Their other ports are too far away. And so now you have a lot of food locked up, and then you have a lot of gas and oil locked up in Russia. Some people describe Russia as, a country attached to a gas tank, a fuel tank. And it is. I mean, they have, they're up there in the top 3 in oil and gas. But now, some of the shipping, and a lot of that's, they can't use the pipelines across Ukraine. They haven't developed other pipelines. They get stuff that comes from, like, say, Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan, that comes by pipeline to the Caspian Sea, then across that to another port of Russia on the Black Sea or the Sea of Azov. And now with Ukraine attacking those ships, which they've done over the last week, that puts all of that at risk, because you can't get insurance. You pay a small percentage of insurance of the value of your house or car for insurance each year. But when you're in the midst of a war, that insurance cost goes up by 100 times. Or, for example, today, this is one of these weird things. Like, I've been to Maui. Okay. Part of Maui is incredibly dry, as dry as anything you've ever seen. But part of it is as lush as anything on the planet. And they're like, you can take a drive around Haleakala, and you can see the line where it's green on one side and brown on the other, where the weather is blocked. And so it's like the worst desert you've ever seen, right after you've driven through a rainforest. But today, Maui, I mean, Lahaina has been effectively destroyed by wildfire. The city on the ocean, the ships were burning in the harbor, the crew, the pleasure craft and tour boats and ferries and that type of thing. And this is Hawaii.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you think anybody's going to get insurance tomorrow to protect their property in Maui? Ain't going to happen.
Yeah. My fear is because there have been a big uptick in natural disasters. And my concern is that people are going to just fall into sort of the climate alarmism. And my conviction is these are significant birth pains we're watching as we're getting very close to fulfillment of Scripture.
Believe me, I get sent stuff and I read it, directed energy weapons and HARP, and we're controlling the weather and all that type of thing. And I take a very cautious approach to that, much to the chagrin of some of my friends. Because what was one of the messianic signs? When Jesus calmed the storm, remember the disciples' reaction was, what manner of men is this that even the winds and the waves obey him?
Yeah.
And then we also know that there are these judgments and birth pangs and that type of thing. They're all wrapped up in this end times thing that really come from God. And so I'm reluctant to give people credit all over the world for it. I think there are things going on, but I think there's a religion that's developed up around the climate,
Yes.
um, where science doesn't matter.
Well,
So
when someone's taking up, the climate activist version of the Ten Commandments to what I believe is the fake Mount Sinai and
right,
smashing them, you have a religion. This isn't orthodoxy. This is a cult. This goes beyond any kind of concern of the environment
right.
or stewardship or any of those things. This is a madness.
But when you bring that up, though, that's when a lot of people their normalcy bias kicks in. It's not that bad. It's happened before.
Yes.
And I remember bad heat waves. I mean, I can remember going to school when it was 102 degrees in Canton, Ohio in the fall, and I can remember going to school when it was, 20 below in the winter. So I saw a picture the other day. It was a picture of some people like trekking up Mount Everest. And the caption they put on the little meme they made up for Twitter or Facebook was, finally, we've found a photo of our parents on their way to school when they were children. And, so there's been extreme weather all the time. But I'm just telling you is that I have the acceleration, all these things happening all at once, and then the convergence, all of these happening at the same time
Yeah.
and accelerating at the same time. And it works on the economy, it works on food, it works on banking system.
It's virtually every category of our lives. Is there's some elements that you could bring back to prophecy or
right
heading towards something prophetic.
And I don't think that that's ever happened in human history. Because I know how my father was and how he tracked these things, and he would be like, his head would be exploding right now. I know that. And it was interesting. So when I came back from Hebron in Israel back in 2017, I pulled out his notes because I was going to talk on Father's Day about this. And I looked at the notes, and it was interesting that he was talking about the same topics 50 years ago on the same calendar date on Father's Day that I was talking about them.
Mm.
It was just, again, it was one of these kind of a convergence thing in my own personal life. So I do think it's significant. But look, I've been talking about this now for 25 years, in public, publicly where other people can listen in for at least 10. And so I'm sometimes amazed. I often wonder if somebody dies and goes to heaven and says, hey, your son's got a fairly popular Bible prophecy talk. And my dad says, my kid, because that's sort of the thing that the advice he gave me was like, don't screw up and embarrass me. That should be one of your goals in life.
Yeah, that whole idea of normalcy bias, going back to that really fast.
Sure.
It's one of the things I would call skepticism versus discernment, and that's in relation to the church, not unbelievers, of course. But I remember speaking with a friend, and he said, "Well, because I was basically trying to make a case for, hey, the hour's really late. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me. Well, back in World War II, they would have thought it was nearing the end too, and I kind of just chuckled to myself, thinking, well, you realize that because of World War II and the Holocaust, I mean, that was the turning point for why the Jews started to be regathered to Israel. And so,
it's where it caused an acceleration.
yes, and so there's this idea that even in church, many dear believers have this sort of view that God is always far off, instead of realizing He's coming soon.
Right.
And
Yeah, we don't know when, and it could be a while. And look, sometimes I'm surprised, but so many times I hear people have been talking about Bible prophecy, teaching, doing conferences and that type of thing. They go like, I never thought I'd see this. We say that all the time. I never thought I'd see the day. Well, now you have seen the day. So what are we going to do about it? And so I'm sitting here looking at, as we're talking, I'm sort of just scrolling through tomorrow, the Financial Times for tomorrow. And it's like, it's just crazy, the economy, the banks, bank warnings. And then you have like this insanity. Like, so they bring in, the wind is falling apart, wind farms for electricity. It's collapsing. And despite the fact that it doesn't work, you need a continuous base load of power from power plants for electricity. But wind and solar only operate maybe 10% of the time at best. What do you do the 90% of the time that they're not operating? And so now we're like gutting our energy grids. And it's just like, it's insane. Here's one: record bank loan losses.
Yeah, every day.
Defaults.
There's
Every day, and commercial properties collapsing. There's a guy who does these videos, Casey. I don't know if you've ever seen him. I just saw one last night, a couple of them last night. And they're videos of nothing. It's sort of like a Seinfeld show, but they're videos of incredible information. So 4 years ago, I went to a conference on a CLE conference in San Francisco. And it's probably I've said this, it's probably the last time I'll ever go there, because the city was looking like it was falling apart then. He walks down Market Street, which is like the major commercial thoroughfare in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And then he walks up Powell Street, which is another major commercial thing. And I've been there. 95% of every shop and business is closed.
Mm.
These are videos from the last month. San Francisco was one of the most vibrant, active cities that you could go to. New York, the same way. And now it's like all being ripped apart. And I mean, it is storefront. I mean, I went to a conference right in the middle of all this. Hotels are closing in San Francisco, which was one of the, arguably one of the most successful cities in the United States.
Well, one of the other things I don't know if you saw this, but this has been common now, and it kind of goes back to Charlie Vector 019er, but just how there's this constant push for passports, digital ID, so on and so forth. Do you know what luciferon? I think that's how you say it,
Luciferase.
I can't even say it right. It's the chemical inside fireflies that gives it that luminescence.
Sure. Yeah. It's used in different devices. Sometimes as they might put it into something sort of like a marker so they can see how your blood is flowing or something like that. So.
Right. And I don't know necessarily how they've
luciferase, I think it's called.
Something like that. I don't know how they've necessarily harnessed it or whatever. But this is an article I saw just a day or two ago, is that they're taking whatever this is, the Lucifer's light, we'll call it, and they're talking about how they're going to use this chemical to basically check people for vaccination status.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about that. Sure.
And I mean, that was, I mean, just the idea that this, the chemical has the name Lucifer in it, and then they're also going to be using it for something that will be able to check your status for this, whatever particular medicines you have or have not taken, which obviously could lend to, can you buy or sell? I find it interesting, and that's not, exclusively on that issue. There's also other areas where this has come up, of this idea of, well, unless you have whatever it is, you're not going to be able to buy or sell.
Yeah, so that's sort of where this acceleration and convergence is going. And so they're talking about how do we do this? And it was just in Scotland. I went to pay for something at a big store, and it said you need to get your credit card approved. Somebody will be over in a minute. And as the guy's walking over, all of a sudden I see a picture of myself on the screen in
Mm-hmm.
the store. And a guy comes over and says, okay, yeah, you're okay. Looks at I don't know what he looked at, and he approved it. And so I walk out of the store and I thought, oh, I wanted to get some water. So I go back in and get the water, and I come up. And now as I come up to the thing, my picture pops up on the screen of the self-checkout. The one that I just had taken. I'm in the database now.
Hmm.
So I think I highly recommend. There was a good podcast, and maybe a guy that you should interview on your podcast when you have time. There's a guy named Patrick Wood. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I've heard many of these names, and I have had not had any of them on the podcast yet.
Yeah, so I've known Patrick for a long time, and he had, I think he and his wife, they had an Airstream trailer, and since they're made up the road here, they spent a week with us about 10 years ago, so we got to talk a lot. And he has a new book out called The Evil Twins of Transhumanism and Technocracy.
Hmm.
He actually did an interview on Monday. So we're recording this on, I don't know if I could say that, we're recording this on August 10th. Is it the 10th or the 9th? 9th.
Yeah, 9th. Mm-hmm.
So on Monday the 7th, he was on Tom Hughes, Hope for Our Times podcast. And you can get it. It's archived. And in that, I haven't listened to all of it, but Tom told me what he said. So I trust Tom. And he said that when this beast system comes in place, it's so when we look at the prophetic scriptures, and I was just listening to somebody today says, well, the beast system, it doesn't come about until after the abomination of desolation, which, depending on how you view this last 7-year period, whether certainly that's a critical event. That's sort of like one of the time markers that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24.
Mm-hmm.
That look for that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So that tells you a lot. Trust Daniel, and you can trust that the book of Daniel was written by Daniel, because Jesus said it was, and he would know. And so these prophecies of Daniel kind of can be pivotal to all this end time thing. So we know from Revelation 13, everything, this happens after the abomination of desolation. But when it happens, and I think this is the point Patrick was making, the system's all there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The whole system is there for that to be implemented. They just got to flip a switch. So what you're seeing now is the convergence of them setting the system up. And you've got central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, coming online. You have things like the WHO and Group of 20, G20 or N20, whatever they call them. They're all talking about these digital passports tied to health.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know exactly how it plays out, but it's going to be ready to go. It's not like, oh, the abomination of desolation happens, and then the beast and false prophet can sit around and say, well, maybe we could implement this. Can we develop a system to kind of track what everybody's? It's going to be ready to go. That's the point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this luciferase is part of it. I think there's a lot of things going on.
Mm-hmm.
You saw the guy from Nokia, I think, at the either World Government Summit or World Economic Forum, saying, forget 5G. Okay. 6G is coming. It's already being rolled out in some places. And the ability of the data transfer. So, I mean, you live here locally. Have you been out by those big server farms in New Albany?
No, I have not. If I have, I didn't realize it.
Take a drive out 161 and get off at, I think it's Beach Road. And on the north side, you got all the limited companies stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have these massive Amazon server farms. And then as you go south of 161, you got the biggest warehouse truck center I've ever seen in my life right there. Then you drive on the left side, you'll see 6 giant server buildings I don't know. I haven't been out there for a couple months. So the sixth one is supposed to be devoted to artificial intelligence. They're already refurbishing the first two. They opened in late 2019, early 2020, and they're already obsolete. So they have these electricians work. I mean, they're paying them an incredible amount of money. I mean, these guys can make like $150,000-$200,000 a year working out there as an electrician.
Yeah.
And so now go try to find an electrician to do something at your house in Columbus. And if you do find a person, you never tell anybody else about them because, then they won't be available when you need them. But these buildings, they're 6 buildings, and they're as long, they're 1,200 feet long, almost a quarter mile long. They're as long as the Empire State Building is tall, like sitting on their side. And it's just server racks. And then so Facebook's got under $2 billion invested in those buildings. Google's spending like $4 billion right across the road to build server farms. And it's stuff in redundant backup generators and all that. I mean, drive down there and see it. Just do it some. It should creep you out. As a friend of mine, I showed him some pictures of it. A pretty good Bible prophecy guy. And he said, that's the mind of the beast right there.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And they're all over the country.
I'm sure
all over the world.
I'm sure it would creep me out. I mean, everything that's going on with transhumanism and AI, I find to be particularly creepy. And I think of, just the idea of being manifested in a physical way as we look into Revelation there. And one of the things that kind of going back to some of our early conversations, we kind of look at this last thing I wanted to talk about, which is AI. One of the things I was just flabbergasted. I was frustrated. It's a great ministry. I'm not going to say the name of it. They don't deal with end time stuff, but they'll go through and they have like a panel of people and they'll talk about different news things and how Christians should view different things going on in the world. And they were talking about AI, and one of the gentlemen said, some of this looks concerning, but hey, we don't need to be afraid of this. We don't need to worry about this. AI is just ones and zeros. And I just kind of scratched. I thought that's kind of a naive view.
So some of the things going on in the background, though, is, there have been some hints that quantum computing is kind of moving up. And then there was some reports this week that they were able to replicate some of the fusion, creating like energy from fusion reaction, which is sort of like harnessing the power of the sun on a miniaturized scale, which would totally upend the world, but would provide this incredible power for computers. And if they have quantum computers, I mean, so somebody said like, the AI we've been dealing with now is like first graders. But even then, I don't know if you saw and they're tying it to biology. And so there's a big push to put AI into diagnosis and that type of thing. And they're actually finding that the AI, in terms of reading radiological exams, is in many cases doing better than the humans. But Scott Pellig on 60 Minutes did kind of an eye-opening segment, probably early April. And one of the things they talked about was for a long time, they wanted to create 3D structures of proteins. Because once they know the 3D structure of proteins, then they can devise medications to alter those proteins. So there's estimated in biology, biological life on Earth, there's 200 million proteins. And the rule of thumb was that it would take one PhD researcher 5 years to get the 3-dimensional structure of one protein. So companies like NVIDIA, it's a video chip, and the processing that they're putting into computers is like, I mean, I had a Mac that was a year and a half old, and it would run out of battery in an hour and 15 minutes if I was using it on a plane. So I was always trying to find, carrying batteries and plugs and all this thing, or just giving up. I just got a new Mac, and it's got that M2 Max chip in it.
Mm-hmm.
I used this thing when we went to California without plugging it in for 6 hours, and I had 80% of the battery life left. That's a year and a half. NVIDIA on there, which has really been moved into artificial intelligence. And there's a great talk that Jason Wang, Huang, gave about NVIDIA's development. He says, compared to what we were doing 5 years ago, we're 1,000 times faster.
It's crazy.
And within the next 2 or 3 years, we could be 1,000 times faster than what we are now, which means in 7 years, they would be 1,000,000 times faster in processing stuff. And so when they did these, it took them a couple of years to figure out how to do the three-dimensional structure of proteins. And once they unlocked that, it literally, comparatively, they were able to do all 200 million of them in a short period of time, comparatively seconds. So they did 1 billion years of PhD research time in a few months.
That's insane.
But they're going to take that, they're going to apply it to DNA. They're going to apply it to other structures, mRNA.
I don't think people can even fathom the things that we're going to be seeing soon because of this acceleration.
Yeah, and so this is sort of, I just caught this on the news, or a podcast I was listening to today, that I believe the what I call the Biden administration, because I want to be accurate and reflect who I think is kind of running things in the background. They're coming out with a executive order or regulation or something tomorrow on this subject that may be pretty significant. And so nobody's walking this back, despite all the guys who expressed concerns in a letter, a couple months ago now. We need to stop this. We need to slow it down. We need to stop development. At this point, it's not happening. It's not being dialed back. I mean, you think China's going to dial it back? You think North Korea's going to Iran's going to dial it back? I think it's very fortuitous. I have not seen it. I don't know that I'll see it. I don't really go to movies anymore. That the Oppenheimer movie came out right now, because the arms race that we are in on AI and what that's going to do is orders of magnitude beyond the development of nuclear weapons in World War II.
Yeah. Now,
factor that into an end time scenario. So all of this stuff, here's the phrase I use, from the old Hemingway, I think The Sun Also Rises. The couple guys are talking, and the guy goes, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the guy says, well, 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly.
And then all at once. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what happened. So this thing, like the beast system, don't know exactly what it's going to be like. Don't know all the elements of it. But we do know that when it's ready to go, when it's going to be implemented, it's ready. It's not like they're going to build it from scratch.
Right.
All of the foundational work is going to be done. And so that's why I think it's important to watch what's going on. So I would disagree very strongly with the guy who said, well, sure, there will be some good things come about from AI, And look, I have 4 artificial joints. I'm not above sort of enhanced human stuff within reason. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it changed my life. Artificial joints. And so I'm not above watching that happen, but I'm just saying is that there's a dark side to this.
Oh, yes. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One last question. And
sure.
I'll let you go. Connected to AI, transhumanism, the artificial person, if you will. So I don't know what your sort of view is on the Nephilim. Obviously there's a lot of disagreement on that in the church as well. But I kind of favor something was going on there, whether angels and people were actually having offspring or there was some kind of ritualistic, strange, weird things going on. So I think of, you think of the global judgment, the first global judgment, and, many Christians believing that part of the reason for the flood was to wipe out this crazy stuff that was going on. So now we have what you're talking about with AI, transhumanism, and this acceleration and what they're doing with DNA. So I wonder,
Yeah.
are we going to see a repeat of some of these crazy things that they were doing potentially, if that viewpoint is correct,
You
back
know,
in Noah's day, the days of Noah?
I'm aware of the different theories. I do sort of lean towards a supernatural interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, that something was going on. And so then when Jesus says that it will be as in the days of Noah, what does that mean? Does it,
Mhm.
so go back and study what it was like in the days leading up to the flood or the days of Lot. Look at what was going on leading up to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. By the way, of the three angels that showed up to talk to Abram there at Hebron, at Mamre,
Mhm.
two of them left and went to Sodom. It was two of those eight, the two of the one didn't. And I think that was the Lord myself. That was a Christophany,
Mm.
pre-incarnate Jesus. But it's kind of interesting. So I mean, like I said, you can go in Israel, you can go to these places where these things happen. You can go to Shiloh where Samuel heard the voice of the Lord. You can go and look at in fact, I was just seeing a video the other night. They're pretty much sure they have identified the gate area where Eli would have fallen over backwards when he heard what his sons were doing.
I just read that in my devotions.
It's very interesting. So it's all connected. Like I said, it's accelerating, converging, and then I always say there's a logistics aspect to it, and then there's also the understanding part. The wise will understand, as Daniel says. And so we should be studying these things. We should be paying attention to what's going on. We can get out of balance, but not talking about it is really out of balance.
I
Talking about it too much, I'm not sure is out of balance at this point, given where we are. Look at geopolitics, economy. Like you said, every major category seems to be fitting into this end time scenario that
mm.
we have patterns and ideas about these things. Now, we don't know exactly how it's all going to come about. I don't think anybody knows. I object to some of my friends who've said, state approved treatments for Charlie Vector are the mark of the beast. I don't buy that. First of all, we don't know if the beast is here yet, although some people think he is. So I sort of I think I've mentioned this before. I have baskets. So I have my Antichrist basket, but there's like sub baskets within the Antichrist thing, so that's this guy, this area, this thing. So I kind of throw what's happening into each of those baskets because
Yeah,
I don't want to call and say, hey, this guy is it, and then he dies or something like that.
yeah.
That I don't think that helps the whole thing. So pay attention to this guy, but pay attention to what he's saying and what people are doing in response to it, whether he's the guy or not. That's, I think, more important.
Yeah, I mean, we're called to be watchmen and to be alert and to be paying attention. I mean, that's really clear, I think, in scripture. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
next time I bring you on, because I mean, there's never going to be a short supply of things to talk about. But
Yeah. So I appreciate it. If you want to have me back, I'd be glad to do it sometime. And
we'll get into Charlie Vector next time. I think that I wanted to talk about Revelation 18 and the merchants of the earth. I was curious to hear some of your takes on that. But like I said, there's so much to talk about. John, I
right.
appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you giving up your time and just letting the conversation go
Yeah.
where it's going to go.
Yeah. If people want to catch us, they could. Most of my stuff is up at Fellowship Bible Chapel YouTube channel, also on Rumble at Real FBC. We also have an app, Fellowship Bible Chapel. And then there are different ministries like Hope for Our Times, Moriel, RTN TV, that have videos of mine up. So if you just do a search for me on YouTube or Rumble, some stuff should come up, including some stuff that, maybe people say bad things about me, but, you can't stop them from doing that, really. So they're wrong, by the way, but that's, that's sort of the price of getting known, I guess.
You mean people said bad things about you on the internet? I cannot believe it.
Yeah, there's bad information on the internet. Hard to believe.
Yeah, I'll have to try and bring you back on maybe around or after Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, and we can talk more then.
Okay, that'll be great. Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, John.
You have been listening to This Late Hour. Your contribution helps pay our fees, improve our equipment, and build better content. It is my hope that your continued support of our show may bring future interviews and exclusives. Our goal is to always be improving our show so that the church may be strengthened in our mission to bring salt and light to this present darkness. May God richly bless you.